Imagine, for a moment, that someone has been riding through your entire life, seated just behind you, a passenger you have never once turned around to face. You feel the weight of them in the reactions that arrive too fast, in the people who unsettle you for no reason you can name, in the patterns that repeat with a precision too exact to be an accident. Most people arrive at shadow work carrying a quiet ache, the sense that their own life is answering someone, just not them. Shadow work isn't merely sitting with discomfort, a kind of private housekeeping you do alone. It is something stranger. It is a two-way conversation with reality itself, in which the unlived parts of you have been sending signals for years, and the world has been answering in a language you were never taught to read. Jung wrote that, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." This means wholeness is not a comfort, it is an act of courage that reorganizes everything. So here is the question worth holding. What if the friction you keep meeting out there is not the world resisting you? What if it is the unrecognized voice of that passenger, asking in the only way it can to finally be heard? By the end of this journey, you will not only understand what that voice has been carrying, you will meet the final revelation, the answer to who or what has been doing the answering all along, and it may unsettle you more than anything that came before. So it is worth asking who this passenger really is. Jung called it the shadow, and he was careful about what he meant. It is not your evil, not your failure, not the worst version of you. It is the sum of everything you decided, very early and usually without knowing you were deciding, was too dangerous or too unwanted to carry in the light. In other words, it is the self you set down in order to be loved, the anger that felt too big for the room, the ambition that seemed improper to admit, the grief you learned to manage before it could inconvenience anyone. None of it vanished. It simply moved to the seat behind you, below the reach of your daily attention, and it has been traveling with you ever since. Jung observed that the shadow is not a moral problem, but a psychological fact. This means it is not something you chose, and not something that makes you broken. It is only the part of you that went quiet when the surface of your life became too costly a place to stand. And that raises a harder question. If this passenger has been with you the whole way, why have you never turned to look, and what did it cost you all these years to keep facing forward? You have already met this passenger. You simply called it by other names. There are moments when it does not wait to be invited. Someone says something ordinary, something the person beside you barely registers, and a heat rises in you far past what the moment deserves, a sting that lingers for days. That gap between the size of the event and the size of your response is the passenger reaching forward. Jung noticed that the shadow reveals itself most clearly in exactly these overreactions. This means the reactions you are least proud of are often the truest map you have of what you buried. Or it is a person. Not someone who wronged you, but someone whose ease or confidence or visibility presses on something unnamed in you. Why does that particular stranger feel like an enemy? Why does that one quality land like an accusation? Hold those questions. The answer is close now, and it reaches further than you expect. So you have begun to see the outline of something that has moved through your life without your consent, leaving its mark in the reactions that ambush you and the faces that unsettle you. That recognition is not small, but the passenger is carrying more than what you feared it would carry, and the most disquieting part is still ahead. Stay with us as we go down into what the shadow's actually guarding, and why, when you finally see it, you may grieve not the darkness, but the years you spent keeping it there. Here is the answer to the question that was left waiting. It is the reason a stranger you barely know can produce a charge so strong it embarrasses you. Jung observed that the shadow refuses to stay politely inside you. It moves outward and settles on the faces of the people around you, so that what you think you see in them is often a disowned piece of yourself. This means the intensity you feel toward another person is rarely just about them. In other words, it is a signal about the distance between you and some exiled part of your own life. Think of projection as catching sight of your own face in a cracked mirror, then blaming the crack on whoever happens to be standing in the reflection. Every shard you find repellent belongs to the glass that you broke. The crack did not form in them. It formed in you long before you ever crossed paths, and the hatred of the fragment is only the old refusal continuing its work at a safer distance. The ancient world understood this before Jung named it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the king first meets Enkidu, he does not meet a stranger. He meets a wild double, carrying everything he had suppressed in his climb toward power. Their meeting begins in violence, in the shock of recognizing something both foreign and unbearably familiar. What you cannot hold inside yourself, you will meet in another person's face, wearing the expression you least want to find in a mirror. Earlier, the shadow was described as the disowned self, the parts of you judged too dangerous, too loud, too hungry to belong. But that description held something back, and this is where it opens. What the shadow guards is not only the material that wounded you, it guards the material that was never allowed to grow. Jung was insistent on this point. The shadow's not only darkness, much of what we bury there is gold. It is the vitality, the creativity, the ambition that were exiled alongside the pain, not because they were harmful, but because someone, somewhere, found them inconvenient. This means the thing you have treated as a wound may turn out to be a reserve, a store of yourself you never knew you were keeping. Think of the dream you quietly outgrew, because wanting it felt embarrassing. Think of the boldness disciplined out of you so early that decades later you still hesitate to name a desire aloud. So ask yourself plainly, what did you love before you learned it was too much? And where did that part of you go when you stopped letting it speak? The most alive version of you did not die with it. It went quiet, and it has been waiting, intact, for exactly this moment. There is a paradox here that the mind resists even after it understands it. The thing you spent the most energy avoiding is carrying what you most needed. The buried life is not separate from yours. It is yours, waiting with a patience that outlasts every distraction you built to avoid it. The most surprising ground is still ahead. Stay with us as we step into what integration actually feels like from the inside, and why nearly everyone who reaches it is quietly astonished by what it asks of them. Here is what integration actually feels like, and it will probably surprise you because it arrives not as relief, but as relationship. A painter who wants to master light does not scrape the dark pigments off the palette. Without them, the canvas stays flat, a surface the eye slides off without believing. Integration is the slow, practicing discipline of holding the dark colors with the same steadiness as the bright ones, until what emerges is a portrait honest enough to be called alive. Jung wrote that individuation does not spare a person life's difficulties. It equips them to meet those difficulties as themselves rather than as a divided stranger. This means integration is not the moment the shadow becomes tame or vanishes into good behavior. It is the moment you stop spending your whole strength holding something down and that freed strength becomes available for living. What surprises people who arrive here is that the shadow does not feel defeated. It feels heard. So consider what that would change. What becomes possible if the part of you that has been shouting through your reactions were finally turned toward and named? And what have you been spending all this time to keep it quiet? What integration gives you in the end is a self that has stopped fighting itself, a quieter and stranger freedom than you may have pictured. Less like winning, more like arriving somewhere you recognize without knowing you were headed there. The question now is not whether this conversation is possible. It is where, in the texture of an ordinary day, it is already waiting for you, already leaving a door ajar in ways you have not yet learned to read. The most useful discovery is still ahead. Stay with us as we step into the places where everyday life becomes the map. Here is where the shadow leaves its door ajar, not in meditation you schedule or journal prompts you compose, but in the ordinary friction of a Tuesday afternoon. In the moment, a colleague's offhand remark lands harder than it should. In the flash of irritation that arrives before you have decided to feel it. Self-honesty, as the way in, is not a brutal audit of everything you have done wrong. It is more like living in a cluttered room with a single window and choosing to open it. You are not asked to sort every object at once. The one sliver of light through the gap changes what you can see, and seeing, even partly, is how the conversation begins. So notice the next reaction you did not choose. What do you feel in the second just after it, before the explaining starts? And when you stay with that noticing instead of arguing it away, what uncomfortable question begins to form underneath? The people closest to you are not only companions, they are, in a sense, the clearest mirrors your shadow has ever found, reflecting the exact qualities you have not yet claimed. When a partner's carelessness lights something in you far larger than the moment, or a friend's easy confidence stirs a charge you cannot explain, you are not only reacting to them, you are meeting something that was yours long before they ever arrived. So watch the shape of it. How often does the anger feel strangely familiar, as if it belongs to a scene from decades ago rather than this one? And what might it be pointing to inside you that still waits, unacknowledged? The same pattern runs through creative work, often more precisely, because there the shadow signs its name in absence rather than reaction. The project you begin with real longing and abandon just before it might be seen. The painting left mid-stroke. The manuscript paused at the chapter where it starts to matter. These are not failures of discipline. They are encounters with the unlived self at the edge of becoming visible. What you have touched here is not a set of techniques to apply and set down. The honest glance at your own reactions, the willingness to sit with what your relationships and your creative life keep reflecting back. These are invitations you accept once and then find yourself living inside. The most transformative recognition is still ahead. Stay with us as we find out what wholeness actually does to a life and to every life it touches. There is a moment, quiet and unmistakable, when the inner war finally pauses. Not because you conquered anything, but because the exile has come home and you are no longer divided against yourself. Wholeness is not the absence of shadow. It is the state in which the shadow is no longer running a counter-campaign beneath everything you do, no longer pulling the thread at exactly the height where you might otherwise rise. And when that war ends, reality stops feeling like a field of obstacles arranged to defeat you. So many of those obstacles were projections of a conflict you were carrying into every room you entered. Here, then, is the revelation promised at the beginning, the answer to who has been doing the answering all along. It was never an external force, never fate, never fortune, never some impersonal universe arranging signs. It was the unlived self, the buried vitality and disowned power you packed away decades ago, returning its signals from below, asking in the only language it had to be recognized and reclaimed. And the ripple does not stop with you. How does a person who is no longer secretly at war with themselves move through a room? What shifts in the people around someone who has stopped casting their unfinished interior onto every face? The stillness travels. Without performance or intention, the integrated person becomes a kind of permission, living proof that the descent into your own darkness is not a loss but a return, and that what returns is larger than what was buried. What you have met here is not a framework to file away. It is a living question that will keep moving through you long after this ends. If something in it stirred a recognition or unsettled a certainty or named something you have carried without words, that response is worth staying with. So I will leave you with this. I invite you to share your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions below. What has this exploration revealed to you? And what will you do now that you have seen it? Thanks for looking.